Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Jason Durall, who is the creative director of Lords of the Middle Sea and all things BRP at Chaosium, and we talked about writing a system agnostic book. This is for the BRP book. It's a very different challenge to write a book that wants to be generic and wants to be as open as possible to all these different ideas than something that might be able to lean in very hard to a single story and a single aesthetic. So Jason talks about the writing tips that you can use to create something like that and tips for GMs and players about how to get the most out of that kind of content for your games. I'll jump across to the interview in just a moment, but first, please subscribe to our channel and thanks for watching.
Absolutely. I mean, the only thing that comes close is if you imagine it's an everything goes setting, like some sort of crazy gonzo setting like Rifts or whatnot, where just, magic and robots and mutations and psychic powers and sorcery and medieval combat and tactical, assault tactics and, modern firearms and all of that. So, yes, you really have to sort of write in this very broad fashion with the idea that like ultimately the system that you're writing for needs to be modular enough that you can create this very solid foundation of a core system, and you're sort of writing with this deliberately either not vague in terms of rules, but vague in like agnostic in terms of specific setting, and then you customize the other material to how it works. For example, like I might write a system for sorcery, but also make a comment that you could easily just pretend this is psychic powers. If it were something like the old Derney novels where you had the secret Derney people running around through medieval Europe and whatnot.
I can imagine that there's still even a level of difference between even a setting like Rift and doing this system agnostic stuff. Because when you're playing something like BRP, because we're talking sort of about the BRP book here, you are still tending to play Call of Cthulhu or a BRP adventure set in the far future or a BRP
Yeah.
adventure set in a mythic world. You don't tend to play them all at once.
Right, right. And I personally think that would lead to a very confusing, muddled, flavorless mess. Like, trying to make some sort of a stew and then just putting every spice you have into it. You would end up with just this sort of, rather than having a strong, interesting medley of flavors like some sort of a curry or whatnot, you would end up with just a just riot of probably heavily over-seasoned stuff. And the same is true, I think, of settings. I mean, a setting is really kind of notable to me by what it doesn't have. Like how is it different? And like I say, putting all the elements in at once, it just seems like you're setting yourself up for a big mess and a headache at that. I personally find these sort of just massive settings with everything under the sun in them to be kind of a little too confusing. Like you have a hard time relating to how the characters exist in these worlds. Now, I like settings where you can have like gateways to different universes, like the old Nexus RPG, or things like Planescape, or even what was I thinking of, the dice with the funky, the one with the funky D20. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. It's the game with the cosm hopping where you've got Torg. Yeah, Torg, where you've actually got multiple realities and you are, your characters can travel between them in a multiversal way. And I think that's actually a really cool use of a generic system that has a multi-universal appeal. Like all of these games, for example, Torg, Amazing Engine, and whatnot, you could replicate with basic role playing.
So let's talk about basic role playing then. How do you write something that is inherently generic and still keep it evocative? How do you make that agnostic writing exciting?
Instructions when you're talking about systems, or you want to get to the level of simplicity that IKEA directions contain. Ideally, if you could just draw little pictures, that would be fantastic too. But ultimately you connect it to the human experience. And I mean, that's the reason that the evocative Vitruvian man symbol has been used for basic role playing, both editions of it, is that it all connects to the human character, the human being at the center of that. What is the character's experience of the world, and how is that the link to how all of these other systems work?
When you were writing this, did you write it in a modular way? Did you take on one specific area and then think of a different setting and different rules that might apply to it? Or did you approach it in a much more holistic way?
I would say a much more holistic, much more scattershot way. Almost. This was conceived a long time ago. The first edition of Basic Role Playing came when I literally pitched it at the stand at Chaosium like 20 some years ago, where I just said, hey, you should do a book that contains all of your basic rules so that whenever I'm running a game that I've custom made, I don't have to drag 8 different rule books to the, I don't have to have ElfQuest and Ringworld and Hawkmoon and Superworld just to play one game. I said it would be awesome if you just had everything plus in one set of covers, with alternate rules. So you could pretty much design your game as you want, like as a building kit almost. And I originally worked with another writer, Sam Johnson, but life and other issues forced him to drop out relatively early on the project. And I ended up taking the rest of the project on myself. And this was I'm not the creator of basic role playing. That's Steve Perrin, that's Greg Stafford, that's Ray Turney, Sandy Peterson, and many, many authors who have contributed to the game over the years on all of the different Chaosium products. And I had the luxury of just this sort of buffet of different games. And at the time, Chaosium was sending me copies of everything they had. And so I could look at that and go, oh, I need radiation rules. Do I want to use the ones from Hawkmoon, which were very rudimentary, or do I want to use the ones from Ringworld, which are very scientific? And, I sort of came up with a synthesis of those. And I wish it had been just a sort of a matter of fact to beginning to end, but it was a lot of very organic, flowing from thing to thing. In some cases, I would just pick up one game and go through it cover to cover and integrate the things that were worth bringing over into basic role playing at a time. And so that sometimes meant like, here's mutations or from Hawkmoon, and then I'd have a little bit something about some various other bits, but then there wasn't a lot else that I could take from Hawkmoon. But ElfQuest, for example, the psychic powers, that all went into basic role playing, and a number of other things, some simplifications of the systems that I liked a lot. So it was a very a scattershot approach, with the final pass on the manuscript sort of applying the necessary bits to make it a cohesive rule system.
I want to jump back to something you said previously. You said that you like to evaluate a system based on what it doesn't do. What doesn't BRP do?
I would say that that we haven't yet explored some large scale mass combat, and it kind of isn't. I don't think it has all the nuts and bolts you need for like space combat or large scale vehicular combat. That's really where, and that gets outside of the player character. I mean, you've got your player figure in the center, but when you're running around on a giant spaceship, hammering another spaceship with repulsor beams or antimatter missiles or whatnot, I think that some of the numbers get a little wonky, and I don't think that the granularity of the system is quite there yet. But we have talked about ways to create some supplementary or source material that will expand on that.
When I think of a great TTRPG book, I think that in a large part, you're right. The IKEA rules model would be fantastic. Less is more. The less you can write, the more you can give GMs the capacity to input their soul into what they're creating, the better. But also, it's really great to have some very evocative descriptions. Obviously, you keep them short. You just have a few. How do you do that in a book like BRP? How do you still create that selling of a world?
Well, for example, for each of the power sets, they sort of assume a particular tone and flavor in the world. And I really made sure that those were very evocative of the genre. So the super world, the superpower descriptions from super world, those were rewritten to be a little more dynamic, a little more like heroic in tone. The mutation section was a little more dark and unpleasant and chaotic and unpredictable, and so those were a little stranger. Whereas psychic powers were also, I went with a very pseudoscientific tone for those, almost imagining the sort of documentation that would have come out of MK Ultra or the Stargate project or whatnot. So, that's the kind of, those are the tones I was hoping for there. And the setting stuff in the back, there's a big chapter on building settings. And it tells you, it lists like a large number of classic settings, and then tells you how to bring in different rules and remove certain rules to evoke the feeling of a particular setting. And I tried to make each of those feel very punchy in the way that is like, this is what this setting is like. It's pretty cool, to get you excited.
To bring things back down to a level of immediate use to everybody, if you are a GM who is maybe playing some Call of Cthulhu, they've played some RuneQuest, seeing the market of available products as it stands today, if you want to pick up the BRP book, what is this going to let you jump into that maybe might not be available out there or might be a little harder to find? Is it just that there's such fantastic 1920s stuff in the BRP book that you'll want to augment your Call of Cthulhu games? Or would you suggest that people dive into hard sci-fi or something like that instead?
No, it's more like you can take the virtue of BRP as a rules, as a book, as a product, is that you can pretty much a la carte things you would like. If you are playing Call of Cthulhu and you think, it would be really cool if I had my characters had psychic powers. I'd like to, have, for example, a game where I've got a group of psychics who are fighting the Cthulhu mythos. And then you can look and you go, oh, hey, here's some expanded psychic rules. Cool. Or even if you wanted to do, superheroes versus the mythos, you could do that easily and just port those rules straight into your Call of Cthulhu game with very little effort. At the same time, there's a slightly simplified sanity system in BRP, that if you think that, say, Call of Cthulhu sanity is too complex or not heroic, it's like a little more too grim, too unforgiving, then you could use this lighter, slightly easier system. And then, like I said, you could build superpowers as monster powers for Call of Cthulhu if you want. There's a whole bunch of different stuff you could take and use.
At the risk of asking you something that you might not be fond of here, what's the favorite rule that you got to put in that you're super excited about, that you think is sweet, you want people to see? And what's the rule that you've never connected with as a player or as a designer, but you still put in because, hey, that other people do, but it's got to be in the BRP book?
Okay. I actually threw in a fate and fortune point mechanic into the earliest edition, and it's carried over. I still like it because it allows the sort of things that it was a predecessor to Call of Cthulhu's luck pool and pushing rolls, for example. It basically lets you spend your power points, which are the equivalent to Call of Cthulhu magic points. You could spend them for re-rolls. You could shift the result of a roll. It wasn't so much a like per point adjusting the actual outcome of a roll. It was turning a fumble into a fail, turning a fail into a success into a special success, or a special success into a critical. And so you could do that in a very high level way. I quite liked that as a system. And also it included things like, spending points to introduce plot elements into the game. Like, say, you get to somebody's apartment, you're looking around trying to break in, and you might say, I spend 3 power points and I find a key under the doormat. And the game master hadn't thought about that, but since you've got this situation of a locked door that could be a scenario breaker, like if they can't get through the door, what happens? You could just say, yeah, you spend some points and you find a key under the door. And it allows a lot of player improvisation and interjection. I also shamefacedly or unashamedly stole a rule from Ian Sturrock's Conan rules, the first edition of the D20 game, where I said you might spend power points equal to a weapon's damage to inflict maximum damage on an opponent. So you can have the, for your epic fight in the final, like, I absolutely need to take this guy down in one shot. You could like just blow a whole bunch of power points and boom, your weapon does maximum damage, rather than, the ultimately unsatisfying, sometimes, you get the shot that you need and then you roll and you're like, oh, 2 points of damage. And how much armor does he have? 6 points. Okay. Well, the shot blinks off of his armor and, so yeah, I'm the most fond of those rules because I also think that they sort of addressed what some people has found problematic or challenging about basic role playing, is that it does give you narrative control and allows a lot more player sort of the player empowerment. The rule that I would say, I mean, and this probably won't come as a huge surprise to anyone who knows me personally or has heard me wax rhapsodic about game design, is I'm not a huge fan of really, really gritty initiative systems. And in particular, sometimes I'm a little troubled with strike ranks. I like a simpler means of determining what order things happen in combat. And I find that that's something that oftentimes, if it's a game that doesn't require them, I generally remove them from the thing. And this was the case with basic role playing.
One more question that might be relevant to people who want to play in BRP systems. This book is a resource not just to have at your table, but also when you're designing your own scenarios. Can you talk a little bit how it's going to help GMs if they want to create stuff for their own games or for publication or for anything like that?
Yeah, the game was released as the first product under the new ORC license, which means it is ultimately open to the world. Anyone who wishes can take these rules, the text of them, and use it to not just build their own scenarios and publish them, but actually build their own games. So you can take this deceptively thick book. It's actually got some really nice, thick, lovely paper that makes it look a little heavier. And you can customize a game to your liking. You want to have a game about mutant Three Musketeers fighting psychic aliens in time-traveled ancient Egypt. And I just pulled that out of my, imagination. But if you want to build that game, you can. And you can just throw out all the rules that you don't need to have for that. And so that's one thing that's quite cool about it. You want to do a cool time travel game, which I think is an especially useful way to do BRP. You can throw out all the stuff you don't need and publish your own game with the actual text that we have released for your own use. And so this not only applies to things on the Johnstown Compendium for RuneQuest or the Miskatonic Repository for Call of Cthulhu, but anything. You can make your own games from scratch. And I think that's something that I think a lot of people are responding quite well to.